Welcome. My name is Rita. I'm the director of the Faculty Center for Innovation, Collaboration, and Support, and I will be your host for the morning. Some basic housekeeping. This is a full 2-hour session, and that's a long time. One of the things that we advocate is taking a trauma-informed approach to teaching, and in part, that means recognizing everyone's humanity and acknowledging their needs. So I love that many of you have your cameras on. This is a large event. You can keep your camera off. You can turn it on. You can turn it off as is appropriate for you. If you need to step away for a moment, please do so. We are recording. We do ask that you please remain muted, but please use the chat as you have been to ask questions or offer comments. We'll try to address them as time allows, and we will also follow up afterward. So, as many of you know already, in the chat, we will repeatedly post a link to a sign-in Google form that we ask you to please use so we have a record of your attendance. I think I can skip that sentence. We'll also post the agenda, which includes Zoom links to various optional information sessions that begin at 11:30. We will repost it near the end of this presentation so you have it again. Right now, we'll begin with a welcome and introductions, and then we'll move into our formal presentation. So to begin, I would like to introduce Michael Schober, who is our Senior Vice Provost and Professor of Psychology.
Hi, everybody. I'm Michael. Welcome. I really want to extend the warmest of welcomes to you. It is so great to have you joining us and just see so many of you here. I just want to say you're joining an amazing community of faculty. Faculty are at the heart of a university with you have an amazing array of expertise and an array of disciplines and practices. And I just want you to recognize you're joining a university there's no other one like it in the configuration of scholarly and creative and professional practices here. It's also an amazing community of students, as I hope you'll discover. Very large international population, just coming from such a different, just all over. It's terrific. You're also joining a legacy of a university and are now stewards of a university that has, for now over 100 years, continually worked at reinventing what a university can be. And it's been known for how vibrant the conversations we have in and out of the classroom. So I look forward to your getting to experience that and being part of it. I know there are going to be so many demands on your time, but I really hope you will have a chance to get to know each other as colleagues and help to continue to build and strengthen and reinvent who we are. You are now part of who we are and this astonishing legacy of scholarship and creative practice and commitment to progress in so many different flavors. So I hope you can avail yourself of the resources in research support, in pedagogy support, and enjoy the liveliness of events and offerings. And just want to let you know we're here for you and we're here for the students, and really very, very delighted to have you join us. Hope you have a great day today.
Thank you, Michael. And now I'm really pleased to introduce Luciana Skruchin, who has just joined us in the Provost's office.
Yes, hello, and extend my welcome to everyone. As I already mentioned, I'm just joining the Provost's office in the role of Associate Provost for Faculty Affairs, but I've been a longstanding member of the university for quite some time. I'm an Associate Professor of Fashion, housed in the School of Fashion in Parsons. I've had the pleasure of working with colleagues and collaborating with colleagues across the university in pedagogy and teaching. I teach undergraduate and graduate students. I generally teach in the space of fashion and textiles and complexities around Black women and gender. So I teach studio-based courses, lecture-based, seminar-based courses, various modalities as well. I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you in person around campus throughout the various events. And also maybe those of you who are joining in a School of Fashion and some of the School of Fashion events or Parsons-wide events. So look forward to getting to know you all. And I do want to echo what Michael mentioned. It's, hopefully throughout your time, your journey here with us, you take the time to attend some of the various events that we have, which are astonishing. Thank you.
And now if I could ask Kate to please introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Rita. Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Evanishin. I'm the Associate Provost for University Part-Time Faculty Affairs. All of you came through various onboarding in your colleges by a member of part-time faculty affairs, be it an assistant dean, an associate director, an administrative person who's juggling a couple of different jobs. Part-time faculty affairs is here to serve you. We are here to help you navigate working at the university. We're here to answer questions. At the provost's office, we are here across all colleges for general questions and to help you sort of orient yourself within this very large and complex institution. And that includes helping you out with resources around HR, benefits, and other questions you might have as you navigate. I'll ask Mimi, who is our program manager for part-time faculty affairs, to put in our non-person email account into the chat, which you can copy. And as questions arise, if you're not sure who your PTF contact is in the college, you can reach out to us and we'll give you a hand. Thank you so much, and we're so happy to have you.
And my two colleagues who are joining in the presentation today, I start with Sheena.
So hi, everyone. I'm Sheena Dury Miller, and I work in the Faculty Center. And we're really here to support you in your teaching and your experience at the new school. So be in touch with us. And I'll pass it on to Sophia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sophia Holtz. I work with Sheena and Rita. Really looking forward to working with you all. And as Sheena just said, please don't hesitate to reach out to us if we can help with anything.
Okay, and Sophia, if I could ask you now to start screen sharing. As I said during as I said at the beginning, during the presentation, and that screen share looks really, thank you. I hope it looks as good for everybody as it's looking for me now, the screen share. As I said, during the presentation, please feel free to put questions in the chat. And actually, before I get going, in the chat, as you join, we will post the attendance form for you to please sign in, and we will post the agenda for today with links to the breakout sessions, optional breakout sessions beginning at 11:30. Please feel free to put questions in the chat. I'm going to ask you to confine the questions you post to the materials that we're presenting, and not about, for example, when do I get paid? What's the tuition benefit? How do I use classroom computers? Questions like that. Those are the kinds of questions for the optional information sessions that begin at 11:30. Today's session is focused on approaches to teaching that promote equity and inclusion. Because frankly, you can't be a good teacher without ensuring an equitable and inclusive learning environment. At the end, and we're doing it at the end because we don't want you trying to multitask, because there is no such thing. At least for me, when I'm reading something, my ears stop working. I mean, they're hearing sounds, but they're not hearing words. So at the end of this presentation, we're going to put several links in the chat. The first of which is to the Guide to Teaching and Learning, which is a great online resource on a variety of teaching issues. And it includes a whole section on a separate link that we'll give you directly to New School Resources, which is a collection of short videos and introductions to a number of student and faculty resources that are there when you need them, rather than having us review it all with you now so you can just forget it. So please review quickly what's available there and then return to it as you need to. Just a quick word about masks. They are optional, but encouraged in small indoor spaces, and many of our classrooms are small. At the moment, most people are not wearing masks, but a small number are. And this link we will put in the chat right now so that you can copy it and save it for later. We have a wonderful video created by our colleague Alba in drama. It's intended to show you how to make yourself understood while wearing a mask and trying to teach in class. But frankly, it's just good advice on how to project and make yourself heard and understood. It's only 10 minutes, and I encourage you to give it a watch. We have a faculty member who teaches theater, and she saw it and she's like, oh my gosh, yes, I need to revisit all of this. And if you're going to wear a mask while teaching, definitely watch it. You can also share it with your students. Finally, we will be sending after today the alluringly named New School Teaching Handout, which includes brief introductions to concepts and strategies in teaching, but begins with various scenarios on when things go wrong between faculty and students. Yes, the scenarios are real and happened at the new school. I will say that they primarily enact interactions that involve experiences of white faculty, and we're in the process of adding interactions that faculty of color encounter. The emphasis of this morning's presentation is on how to create a classroom environment in which all people in the class, faculty and students alike, are respected, seen, and heard. Throughout this presentation, we'll be trying to practice transparency, which is a foundation of teaching for equity and inclusion. What, why, and how are important for promoting engagement and communicating transparency of expectations, even down to how much time students should expect to spend on a particular activity, because otherwise, how will they know? Also, there's a saying that I like to quote from an economics professor. My own background is in literature, but he was like a huge teaching mentor to me. Math, here's the quote, "Math is taught by people for whom math is easy." In other words, you already know how to think about the stuff you're teaching and probably do it like breathing. Most of your students will have no idea. Concepts that are so natural for you that you don't even need to think about them, students will have no clue. Unfortunately, because of our numbers and what we have to cover, we will not be doing what we're going to be encouraging you to do, which is employ active learning strategies and practices, because this Zoom lecture is not the best way to learn. There was a study a number of years ago that showed that people watching television actually displayed greater brain activity than those listening to a lecture. But we're time constrained, so we'll do our best to keep your brain activity elevated. So, in the interest of transparency, we're going to begin by talking about the value of community agreements and also to model creating a supportive and inclusive learning environment, even on Zoom with 120 people. Following that, we're going to talk about one example of a warm-up exercise that we like to use to encourage a willingness to be vulnerable and open to the things we'll be discussing. Because of the size of the group, we won't use it, but we wanted to introduce it as something you might want to employ in class. I will very quickly introduce some concepts and practices in pedagogy, because most people teaching in higher ed have never actually learned how to teach. We'll briefly introduce the concept of implicit bias to frame our thinking for the bulk of the presentation. Now, I've just said implicit bias. We all have implicit biases because we are all human beings. It's important to recognize that we all have implicit biases in order to begin to address how those things that we're unconscious of impact our teaching and our students. We'll define equality and equity, and then we'll introduce principles of inclusive teaching. Now, let me say they're framed as inclusive teaching, but honestly, they are simply good teaching practices, period. But most importantly, as I just said, you can't be a good teacher without ensuring an equitable and inclusive learning environment. Finally, we'll talk again about implicit bias and self-awareness. Sophia?
So to begin, community agreements. They're a tool to introduce to your classroom to lay a strong foundation for a supportive and equitable space that makes clear that all voices are heard. They create a space that values speaking from one's own experience, not expecting someone to speak for an entire identity group, like expecting the one student with purple hair to speak on behalf of all students with purple hair, or on behalf of students who seem to have unnatural, big quotes, hair color, because what is that? It asks that students speak only for themselves and from their lived experience. They provide a framework to address tense or loaded topics in a way that is equitable, listening to and valuing all voices and viewpoints, whether or not we agree. They are a tool of accountability for the entire class, including the instructor. We're going to go into a few specific agreements in more detail, but the important point is that community agreements foster greater equity and inclusion, and in a classroom setting, they can prevent problems from happening and can be a great place to return to when emotions or tensions are running high. Using community agreements supports work in equity, diversity, and inclusion, and is frankly fundamental to good teaching these days. It's hard to have an equitable and inclusive classroom, a socially just classroom, without some forms of community agreements. So these are some places to start. We will make I statements. I can speak only from what I know, I think, I feel, I hear. As in, I heard you say, rather than, well, you said, which is an invitation to an argument rather than an opening to discussion. Because I heard you say is usually followed by, well, that's not what I meant, which gets us to intent versus impact. We return to intent versus impact all the time because your intent might have been benign or even supportive, but if the impact was hurtful, offensive, or dismissive of my experience and what I was communicating, then it doesn't really matter what your intent was, other than I acknowledge that you didn't intend whatever it was, but it still hurt. It still impacted me in a way that shut me down. And how you handle that as an instructor is that you apologize. You say, I'm sorry, I will try to be more aware of the impact of my words. And then you move on if the one who was hurt is ready to do so. Because it's not about you who said the thoughtless thing, it's about the person you hurt. The important thing is not to pretend nothing happened. One mic, only one person talking at one time, which is directly related to practice active listening. This is really important for students and a little hard for faculty since you also need to be managing what's going on, but it's what really good facilitators do. That is, don't be thinking about what you're going to say in response. Focus on what's actually being said. And then ask yourself, if you're a student, does something need to be said here? And am I the one to say it? And as faculty, be willing to allow the silence while the students think about it. A lot of what we're talking about when practicing engaging in a community through the use of agreements like this requires some extra time and extra space for thought and reflection. Some people worry that taking this time for work takes time away from covering the content that you need to cover, but creating an environment where students are willing to engage, even when it's uncomfortable, actually improves students' progress in the content of the course. Which brings us to make no assumptions. People do, even if you think you're not. And safe versus brave. Comfortable and unchallenged versus uncomfortable and challenged. We can't guarantee student safety from unintended hurtful remarks, from ugly images, from painful history, but we can agree to be brave in the face of those challenges. And we can agree to be uncomfortable and brave together through these other practices.
All right, so thank you for that, Sophia. I'm going to continue with a few more community agreements. Mainly, we will criticize ideas, not people. And I want to say that these practices, they help foster a space where all voices are going to be heard and respected, and in which we're going to acknowledge impact, as Sophia said, even when intentions come from a well-meaning place. So with we will criticize ideas, not people, this means really, instead of calling attention to someone who has said something that's offensive or harmful, we're going to critique and correct what they said. That way they're not on the defensive. Next, move up, move up. This is a good classroom management tool. If you usually don't talk that much, you might challenge yourself to speak more. If you find yourself speaking a lot more than others, you can challenge yourself to up your listening. It's a really good classroom management tool for the quietest and more outspoken students. Honor silence. Sometimes, you might be teaching and you ask a question, no one answers, and you just got to get comfortable sitting in that silence. And that goes along with asking questions and really stopping to listen and hear those responses and listening too for what's not being said. These next couple are also very important. We can't be articulate all the time. It's so important to show your students that you too make mistakes. It lowers the stakes for them to just be who they are and mess up too. Makes things okay. You also want to acknowledge that if and when we cause harm or make a mistake, we hope we can all agree to engage with each other with grace and understanding and not with accusations. So remember to return to, I heard you say, as opposed to, well, you said, to open up that conversation and rather than instigate the argument. And no one knows everything. We all know something. Together, we know a lot. This sort of community agreement reminds your students of their roles as contributors to your classroom and to everyone's learning. It's really empowering, and it's empowering for them to see that you're learning from them and that you're continuing to learn too. Zachary, move up, move up. That is just if someone's not talking a lot in class, to encourage them to maybe consider upping their speaking, or if they're talking a whole lot, maybe to up that listening. And our students, especially the US American students who are coming right out of high school, are really, really knowledgeable about issues of equity, diversity, gender, race, ability, size, you name it. They're more familiar with that than a lot of us are. And it's okay to recognize that they know things we don't. We shouldn't be afraid of that. It's actually really empowering for them to come into a classroom and be able to teach us something. So we should welcome that. This list that you'll see next, I'm not going to go through all of these, but we're going to email these to you. So a lot of faculty use these. The main thing to remember is that what you're trying to do is set up a space where your students, where everyone can really hear each other and really be present for each other. And a key thing to remember with that is to slow down, to stop, to think, and how to implement. So the community agreements, they really establish how we agree to be together as a community of learners for the whole semester. You can bring them into your classroom at any time. We recommend for you to do it from the beginning, from that very first day. And because of the add and drop period, you may need to revisit them a few times, but that's really worth doing because those who have heard it are reminded of what you've all agreed to, and those who are new will have a chance to weigh in and maybe expand the agreements or edit some of them. You can draft a few examples, introduce them to your students, and invite them to add and modify the list until everyone is in agreement about the agreements. What you really, I keep saying really, and I really mean to say really, because these are really important. You want to be sure that all students agree. I've seen faculty who have community agreements on their syllabus and think they're done, but that's not really using them. If you're just putting them on the syllabus and you're not having a discussion, that means students aren't modifying them or weighing in. They're not actively agreeing. They might not have even read them. If you want to use them effectively, you need to have them in a conversation, and you need for students to agree to hold each other accountable and to hold you accountable as well through the agreements. The tools are only as good as the hands that wield them, right? If you don't use community agreements effectively, they're not going to be effective. You can't just introduce them on the first day and walk away and think, okay, I have community agreements. You got to keep coming back to them. You need to ask students if any of them need to be modified, if there's anything you're overlooking, something we want to add or remove, and let them be a living document that you come back to, you revisit, you modify, especially when things get sticky.
So as I mentioned at the beginning, this is an effective warm-up for encouraging vulnerability and risk-taking. Invite students to share their name and pronouns if they choose to share them. Briefly, the new school does not have a standard policy regarding pronouns. This is our preferred approach if you choose to share. Requiring students to identify their pronouns can put them in a tough position of either outing themselves when they're not ready or using a pronoun that they'd prefer not to. They're not ready to share. So we recommend making it optional. And then, so ask them to share name, pronouns if they choose, and then respond to these two prompts using these exact words. Depending on the size of your class, you can use this warm-up collectively or break students into smaller groups. It's best if you, as the faculty member and person in authority, model the behavior you're hoping for. When we use this warm-up, I usually start it off and share a rather personal story to put myself out there. I would say, my name is Rita, my pronouns are she and her, and one thing you can't tell about me just by looking at me is that until 6 years ago, my name was Kathleen. And then I go on to describe a pretty serious emotional mental breakdown that led to my becoming Rita. And then I say, because I'm mostly working with faculty, actually, I'm almost entirely working with faculty. And then I say, and it's important for me to tell you all here today that, because it has actually made me better able to do my job, which is to support you. Now, it's a very personal story that I share, but I do make clear that that's not required. And students can also pass if they choose. But I stress again that it's important to use this exact phrasing because it makes a difference in how they respond. And a willingness on your part to be vulnerable encourages trust. That said, we understand that not all faculty, especially faculty of color, faculty who are trans, faculty who are women, not all faculty feel that they can express vulnerability, or perhaps not vulnerability at the outset. But the value of trust is you hope students who have concerns about the course or your teaching or another student in the class, that they will feel comfortable enough approaching you with their concerns. Now, we're going to take a brief foray into talking about teaching. In the last 20 years, there's been a lot of research into how we actually learn things, first propelled by faculty in science, technology, engineering, and math fields, aka STEM. With the rise of research in cognitive science, we are beginning to know how brains work, which means we can adopt practices supported by what we know to be effective in helping students learn and grow. As I said earlier, most faculty in higher ed have never actually learned how to teach. They tended to teach what they were taught the way they were taught it. It's very important that you think intentionally about what you want students to learn and how you'll help them get there. Before we focus more intentionally on inclusive teaching practice, we want to introduce some basic active learning strategies, like not what we're doing here, which is lecturing at you, and some concepts in teaching. You'll find more about them in the teaching handout that we'll share with you after this session, and in the guide to teaching and learning that we'll give you the link to when we stop talking at you. So this is a whistle letter to encourage you to want to learn more. Active learning strategies can include writing to learn, which is using nonstop, no pre-thinking writing to respond to a prompt, a concept, an image, a piece of music. Drawing to learn, which is using drawing in the same way as writing. Group or team-based activities, which is just as it sounds, though it's important that groups are clearly structured and that they know how they'll be evaluated individually and as a group. Guided inquiry is when the teacher provides a kind of scaffold or roadmap that leads students intentionally toward more complex concepts and deeper insights. And problem-based learning, which is usually team-based and structured around real-world or realistic problems, and is very holistic and effective in leading students to a whole picture understanding. All these kinds of strategies encourage and foster deeper learning because students are figuring things out by themselves and together with other students, but in an intentional and supported way. Backward design is about how you design your class. I know most of you are starting to teach next week and hopefully already have your syllabus. I also know that some of you don't have a lot of latitude in what or how you teach your assigned course. But I mention it here so as you start to teach, you might think about how what you're doing might have benefited from this approach and what changes you might make in the moment or in the future. In backward design, you start by asking yourself, what do you want students to learn? How will you know if they've learned it? And then how will you help them get there? You build the course from the end and then figure out what learning activities will help get them there in scaffolded ways, ways that build on each activity incrementally, so students are building on bite-sized chunks of learning and feel challenged, but not overwhelmed. And quickly, mindset is the belief that brains are malleable and that we are not limited by innate talent or intelligence. It's the belief that with effective effort, we're capable of learning and growing. And Bloom's taxonomy and metacognition, I'm going to spend a little more time on. Many faculty are at least, do I have a description here? No, I don't. Okay, very quickly, there's an image on the screen, and it's kind of very dark red at the bottom and graduates to what when I was in high school was called Dusty Rose. And on the left, there's a series of increasingly smaller donut-shaped circles, one on top of the other, and there's kind of a banner streaming out from each one with more text that describes the words on the donuts. On the bottom, it's remember, above that is understand, then apply, then analyze, then evaluate, and all the way up to the top in a rather small donut is create. This is Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive domain. Many faculty are at least somewhat familiar with or have heard of Bloom's taxonomy, which was created to promote higher forms of thinking like the ones that I just narrated, rather than simply focusing on rote learning or remembering facts. One value of showing this to students is that the foundation is remembering. Students think they don't need to remember because they all have Google in their hands and now they've got ChatGPT. But it's important to embed knowledge in your mind because it helps the brain make connections that Google and ChatGPT can't do across different subjects, processes, and domains. And memory is a foundation of creativity. We have to remember things to develop higher forms of thinking, learning, and creativity. Importantly, there are two other taxonomies modeled on this one. The psychomotor, which includes things like learning to make a hat or play the bassoon, and the affective, our emotions and our value systems. I mention these two because many faculty, especially those in more, let's call them traditional academic disciplines, tend to think of students from the forehead up. And it's important to remember that their brains are in bodies that feel emotion, connecting learning to physical actions, even if the content of the course has nothing to do with movement. And with our emotional reactions and connections, deepens student learning. Now, flowing from Bloom's taxonomy, other education thinkers and scientists have created different taxonomies, some less and not all of them are hierarchical. One that I prefer is called the Taxonomy of Significant Learning, and it's in the teaching handout that we'll be sending to you. It begins with learning to learn.
So metacognition is a foundation of learning to learn. It includes a critical awareness of and self-reflection on A, one's thinking and learning, and B, of oneself as a thinker and learner. So thinking of oneself as a learner. Metacognitive practices are particularly important for our current students with their short attention spans and their penchant for multitasking. Metacognition can help them become conscious of their many unconscious behaviors while also strengthening their learning. As they plan their approach to an activity or an assignment, ask them to monitor what they're learning about themselves in the process and to evaluate how the process went in different contexts, like a lecture versus a discussion, or doing a reading, watching a video, participating in a making activity, or in group work. Ask them to ask themselves questions like, how did I go about approaching the assignment? What was most confusing in the material I was reading? Why? And what might I have done differently? What was difficult for me in this discussion? Why did I keep checking my phone while I was supposed to be watching the demo? How did taking a short break affect my attention to the reading? As I said, It's all about making conscious the unconscious activities, practices, and ways of being that affect learning. One of the 3 key findings in the publication, How People Learn, which is an extensive study into neurocognitive processes of learning, is around the effectiveness of metacognitive approaches to instruction for improving student learning. In other words, it works, and it's kind of simple. Metacognition is also a practice that you yourself can use. Rita talked about intentional course design. We ask that faculty also be intentional in their interactions with students. Our classrooms can, intentionally or not, replicate the power dynamics and injustices we see in greater society. As faculty in a position of authority, we have the responsibility to look for and understand how this happens so that we can help students thrive. Our primary goals today are to learn to intentionally incorporate pedagogical principles of equity in our teaching in order to cultivate learning environments where all students feel respected, valued, and supported in their learning, and to engage in some self-reflection about our own identities, biases, and roles in disrupting the cycle of oppression. Some of what we will share today includes concepts and practices you can immediately incorporate into your teaching, like the community agreements we did at the beginning of this presentation. But much of this work is personal and internal, and it takes a true willingness to be open, to listen, to learn, and to change.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about implicit bias. Last week, we did a session with Lang first-year fellows, and I asked them, who's biased? Raise your hands. And I was so impressed that almost every student raised their hand, because it's not easy to admit that you're biased. But the bottom line is we all are, and it's automatic. You know, we're wired to think in categories, to make snap judgments in fragments of a second, and it starts probably before we're even born. The 4th bullet on the slide, implicit cognition, refers to unconscious influences such as knowledge, perception, and memory. And these influence a person's behavior, even though they themselves have no conscious awareness of those influences. What you need to remember is we all have them, these implicit biases, and that's how we evolved to survive. Unconscious beliefs and attitudes have been found to be associated with language and certain behaviors like eye contact, blinking rates, and smiles. Instructors telegraph bias, and their students see it even when the instructors think they're not biased. And this bias, it's not all bad, right? It's how two-year-olds know how to dig into ice cream and maybe be cautious about those Brussels sprouts, which might be poison. The goal we should have is to monitor our bias so that it's not steering us and directing us. And once we're aware of our own hidden unconscious biases, we can monitor them, we can monitor our thinking and our attitudes so that those biases aren't guiding our behavior and impacting others. Beyond changing your own behaviors, you can also pay attention to the biases in others, including in your students. Sometimes you'll find too that implicit biases aren't all that hidden. We may be all too aware that we clutch our purses when we see a Black man approaching us, or that we assume someone with a Southern accent isn't educated. These biases can be so deep that we doubt we'll ever be able to change them. But if we know we have them, we can try to short circuit them, and also to be conscious of whether we're allowing them to affect our thinking, our words, and our actions. To see how your own bias shows up, you might decide to take some of the Harvard implicit bias tests. There's a whole lot of them. The tests don't actually check your right and wrong answers, but they measure your reaction times when associating images or words with words like good and bad things. In other words, they're testing whether unconscious bias, they're testing what's unconscious versus what you have to think about. A lot of test takers report too that when they're taking the test, they can feel their hidden biases during the test taking. Next, we're going to watch a short video about implicit bias.
Let's hope this works.
Our brain is hardwired to trust what's familiar and be suspicious of what's unfamiliar. It's a basic survival instinct that's helped keep us safe for thousands of years.
We unconsciously sort things into familiar versus unfamiliar, same versus different, them versus us. Here's a test. How do you feel about people who own a handgun,
Don't attend church.
Vote for the other candidate.
are on welfare,
Don't eat meat.
have tattoos,
Don't believe in marriage.
drive an electric car,
Didn't go to college.
don't speak English,
Curse.
Are over 60.
are disabled,
Drive the speed limit.
Love cats.
love dogs. Can you feel your brain sorting people into groups? Was there a little them versus us happening? It can happen unconsciously.
All right, so we're gonna take a moment and just think, how did you feel intellectually, physically, emotionally, while watching that video? Definitely not necessary, but if anyone wants to share their response in the chat, you're welcome to. Sound design was kind of zany. Okay. One thing I felt discomfort with the tone of the categories. Thank you, Georgia. I also want to add that doing these little check-ins in your class can be really helpful and give students a moment to really process whatever you might be talking about.
Interesting, your responses are interesting. I really like that video as a cat person. Because to me, I can feel my anxiety. I've watched this video, I don't know how many times, and I can feel kind of the stress and anxiety because it is what we do. But we can, we try not to, we think we don't, but when I hear a Southern accent, having grown up in the North, is there kind of an instantaneous reaction? Yeah, but at least I am now aware of it. And it's like, I wish I didn't have it, but I do. So now we're going to move on. Equity and equality. Earlier, when I was talking about Bloom's cognitive taxonomy, and I described the image rather quickly on the screen, I'm going to describe this one a little more thoroughly. It is a practice of universal design for learning, not to assume anything about your students, which means, among other things, not to assume that you all are seeing the image that I am seeing. So the image that I am seeing is a rectangle with a green background. There's a top rectangle, and then below that, a bottom rectangle. There are graphical representations of bicycles and people, 4 of each on the top and 4 on the bottom. On the top, under the label equality, there are 4 bicycles, all the same size. Beginning on the left, there's a bicycle next to a person in a wheelchair. Next, a very tall person scrunched over the bike. Next, a modest-sized person for whom the bicycle seems appropriately sized. Finally, a very small person who can barely reach the pedals and certainly couldn't reach them while also sitting on the seat. This is equality. Everyone has access to the same thing. Below that, under the label equity, on the left is a person on a hand cycle, pedaling with their arms. Next, a very tall person on a very large bike that seems appropriate to their height. Then the same moderate-sized person on the moderate-sized bike that was in the equality image above it. And then finally, a tiny bike that seems appropriately sized to a smaller person who's riding it comfortably. This is equity. Everyone has what they need, but their needs are all different. Equity and equality are often used interchangeably, and in some other English-speaking countries they are, but not in the US. And I actually like this distinction. Treating people equally and treating people equitably are 2 very different things. Equality means you give everyone the same thing. Equity means you give everybody what they need according to their needs. The most common graphic used to illustrate the concepts of equity and equality shows people of different heights standing on boxes or ladders to be able to see over fence, usually watching a baseball game because it's America, right? But that, or Japan, but that implies that something is inherent to the people that makes them have different needs, when in actuality, everyone is at the same height, and it's structural oppression that creates the differences. There's a newer version of that image that has a fourth that shows the fence or wall removed, and everyone can see easily. And that image is labeled justice. I had an eye-opening moment a couple of years ago with a disabled person who was talking about how she hadn't used to identify as disabled, like as a disabled person, until she realized that she actually wasn't a disabled person. It was society that made her disabled through its creation of certain structures that she was unable to navigate. Society has structured everything for the dominant group. In the US, that's typically able-bodied, white, Protestant men of Northern European descent who are heterosexual, cisgender, and importantly, right-handed. We have made you, quote, disabled because you can't walk up a flight of stairs. And we've only provided a flight of stairs. We have made a left-hander, quote, abnormal by giving them scissors that only cut with the right hand.
All right, so next we're going to dive into inclusive teaching principles. And I'll start by reading what's on the screen. Inclusive teaching involves deliberately cultivating a learning environment where all students are treated equitably, have equal access to learning, and feel valued and supported in their learning. Such teaching attends to social identities and seeks to change the ways systemic inequities shape dynamics in teaching learning spaces, affect individuals' experiences of those spaces, and influence course and curriculum design. And that's from the University of Michigan Center for Research and Learning and Teaching. They have a lot of great resources. And inclusive teaching requires intentional practice over time. It's not something you think about once and then think you're done. It's more of a mindset that's going to shape your approach to course content and learning activities. Ideally, inclusive teaching stems from your own awareness about the ways that bias and systemic inequities, such as racism, sexism, and ableism, and all the isms and all the phobias, affect student learning experiences, the ways they experience them, and even what they're able to experience. Again, awareness is a muscle, and the more you exercise it, the stronger it's going to get. So we'll talk about some of the best inclusive teaching principles. We're going to go into the details in a little in greater detail, but first I'll give an overview for you. And first I'll also read the bullets that are on the screen. So the first one is inclusive climate, sense of belonging, critical engagement of differences, promote transparency, and self-reflection and self-awareness. And first and foremost, and I promise we can't say it enough, we have to be aware of our own identities and our own biases, both explicit and implicit, and how they inform our thinking, decision-making, and interactions with our students. Again, don't get tired of us saying it because it's really important. Awareness is a muscle. So students need to feel like they belong. Something you can do to help is, I think, very basic. Get their names right, get their pronouns right. If you have trouble remembering names, you can use name tints, cards that they place in front of them with their names and pronouns if they would like to share, or name tags. And if you're online, Zoom makes it easy. You can facilitate a sense of academic belonging by ensuring a broad range of social and cultural identities are represented on your syllabus and by welcoming diverse voices and experiences. When we were meeting with the Lang students, one student said, it's not enough just to have that diverse syllabus. Like, you have to go deeper than that. Don't bring in something that you don't know how to teach. So you want to be representative and you want to know what you're talking about. And that means students really notice that. You also want to make sure you're providing multiple entry points to learning, like not just having text, but including video, or not just relying on audio, but having some graphics. Consider how the biases of your own education have shaped your approach to teaching. We all tend to teach what we were taught the way we were taught it. The times have changed and we need to challenge that. You could consider designating a class skeptic to challenge assertions. This can be a lot of fun. Basically, you have one student argue the other side, whether they believe it or not, and that can get the conversation going and you can see where that leads. Also, in regards to promoting transparency, let your students know why you've selected the materials you've selected, why you've made the decisions you've made in each aspect of your course. Transparent teaching helps ensure all students have access to the same information and a clear understanding of your expectations and the value of the work of their work in your class. There's no reason for your class to be a mystery. I see in the chat, someone has asked, what's the best way to ask students for phonetic
Dina,
pronunciation?
I'm responding to that.
Okay, well,
I'm responding in the chat.
okay. So I'll keep going then and move. I'm going to now go deeper into inclusive climate and belonging. So this is, ensuring that inclusive syllabus, promoting diverse viewpoints, learning and using students' names and pronouns, employing peer learning opportunities, and creating other opportunities to encourage students to make meaningful connections with their peers, and bringing the principles of universal design for learning into your class. Students need to feel like they belong. If I don't see people like me represent on the syllabus, how am I going to do as well as the students in the class who are represented? Several studies in the last decade have shown that students' feelings of belonging are strongly correlated to their academic performance. Research shows that feeling excluded, marginalized, or devalued on campus or in a class can be a significant barrier to student learning and success. If you don't feel like you belong there, it's really hard to learn. You can facilitate a sense of academic belonging by making sure a broad range of social identities are represented in your syllabus and by welcoming diverse voices and experiences. This can include bringing in different guests who are from various backgrounds and have different perspectives. Make a point to choose examples from a variety of cultural domains to illustrate course concepts. Have students provide examples themselves and share your own experience. Educational psychology teaches that diverse classrooms where students from different backgrounds communicate their different experiences and perspectives encourage students to think in more complex ways, which is necessary for an informed and thoughtful community. Thinking in complex ways requires the skills and willingness not to be timid while we ensure academic freedom, inclusion, and experimentation. This includes not just US issues of race and politics. International students who, at least in the past, have comprised almost half of our student body can feel marginalized by a faculty member who constantly uses US references or who doesn't understand that in certain cultures, the teacher is the authority and students don't speak or question that authority. So try to keep in mind where your students are coming from and what their expectations are. Learn what students want to be called, and friendly reminder, this might be different from the name that is on your roster, and learn how to pronounce it. Get their pronouns right. If you have trouble remembering names, like I said, use tent cards, name tags, develop a practice of having students say their name every time they speak or participate. And you can do the same with your name and your pronouns to signal that it matters to you and that you want to get it right. And also, develop a practice of correcting a student if they misgender another student. You don't have to make a big deal out of it. You can just say, oh, Anna, they think, and you can also have students go around and reshare their pronouns as they're comfortable so that not one student is on the spot. As we said in our community agreements, we all know something and students have a lot to offer. Employing peer learning opportunities deepens learning because it's much harder to explain something to someone else than to simply learn it yourself. It also promotes collaboration and community building, and it's empowering for students to be able to share their wisdom with others. And finally, universal design for learning is a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insight into how humans learn. It's about using multiple modes of engagement and recognizing that different students learn differently, and some students have learning disabilities. Again, consider using audio and video, text and graphics. Faculty who practice UDL allow students to choose how they're going to submit work. For example, a research paper or a website, or creating a video or a game. Faculty promote more and broader student engagement by using small groups and pair share exercise to encourage participation from students who might not want to speak up in front of the whole class. Critical engagement of differences. So consider how the biases of your own education have shaped your approach to teaching. Emphasize the range of identities and backgrounds of experts in your field. Designate a class skeptic to challenge assertions. So first thing you want to look at is who's on your syllabus. The white Western canon has dominated higher education, and that's something we can challenge. We had a first-year student report that she was in a history class on the African diaspora, and guess what? Every author on the syllabus was a white man. And this is, history of the African diaspora. If there aren't non-white scholars and artists to be included on your syllabus, talk with your students about why that is. Discuss that. Acknowledge the lack of representation and what needs to happen in your field to change that and to introduce diverse voices, perspectives, histories, and values, and do your homework. Figure out who's out there who you might not know about, who's missing from your syllabus. Keep asking yourself that. Select content by authors of diverse backgrounds and content that recognizes diversity and acknowledges barriers to inclusion. Emphasize the range of identities and backgrounds of experts who have contributed to your field as artists, performers, researchers, and scholars. This also helps students see themselves and their successful experiences in your course content. Some students, especially at the new school, will push back against faculty when they feel the syllabus isn't representative of anything other than the dominant culture, i.e. white, Western, hetero, cisgendered society. Faculty often ask students, well, who do you think should be included? And that's not a bad question to ask, but it shouldn't be on your students to educate you. So take the time to educate yourself about who's writing, researching, working, and creating in your field. And again, if there really is a lack of diversity, consider a discussion about the reasons for that, the reasons for a history of limited access to the field. Why are some people or groups not represented? What can be done to remedy that? What is being done to remedy that? And don't assume that all students will recognize the cultural references you use. Ask yourself how students with different identities might experience the course material. And I'll say it one more time, promote a class skeptic to challenge assertions, whether they agree or not, to generate a diversity of thought. Transparent teaching. This might be my favorite inclusive teaching principle. Again, I'll read the points on the slide. Explain your rationale behind course design and course elements. Transparent teaching also makes clear to students why they're being asked to do a task, and it helps students understand value of work. It's used to seed authority and agency from instructor to students and empower students in decision-making about course materials, activities, and objectives. And it allows students to participate in goal setting and performance expectations. So we've been really promoting the principles of transparent teaching as we've been giving presentations on Gen Z, because Gen Z students will not do something just because we tell them to. But beyond that, transparent teaching is just the smart thing to do. Students are more likely to persist through challenges when instructors communicate high standards, provide clear paths to success for all students, and are transparent about expectations and norms. And this benefits all students, but especially first-generation college students and other groups who have been traditionally underserved by higher education. Teaching students effective learning strategies, letting them know how much time they should be spending on specific assignments, providing assessment rubrics that outline clear criteria for success on those assignments, and sharing stories about your own challenges and successes in learning difficult material all promote transparency and inclusion, and that they promote student learning. Your class shouldn't be a mystery. So tell students why you designed the course the way you did. Tell them why you chose this particular reading or that activity. Clarify what you expect students to get out of the experience, and then follow up and find out what they actually got out of it. Ask students to participate in decisions like determining how a group project will be evaluated, or what constitutes work that would receive an A, or work that wouldn't, work that would be insufficient. These are all powerful tools that have been shown time and time again to improve both student engagement and deepen learning. And we're going to return to the concept of implicit bias because it underlines so much of what we think and do and is the likeliest cause of the harm we cause. If you come to our workshop on implicit bias and microaggression, we'll talk even more about uncovering these unconscious beliefs.
Your brain, by some accounts, receives roughly 11 million pieces of information each second, but your conscious brain is only able to process about 40. How do you handle all the rest? You handle it because you're really using two brains. Your conscious brain, which works with facts and data, has very little capacity and processes information slowly, and your unconscious brain, which is habit and intuition driven, has huge capacity and is really fast. One of your unconscious brain's best tricks is its ability to recognize patterns and use them to assign people and things to categories, allowing your unconscious brain to deal with all of the known, not dangerous issues, and leave only the few unknown or dangerous issues to your conscious brain. This allows us to recognize a pattern and act on it, rather than having to think about every interaction as if we were experiencing it for the first time. We can glance at that four-legged animal and know if it's a wolf or a cocker spaniel. That recognition allows us to make assumptions about the animal facing us, that the wolf belongs to the wild animal category and is likely to be dangerous, or that the cocker spaniel is in the domestic dog category and not likely to be dangerous. The assumptions we make about these pattern groups are likely to be based on our own experiences, on information we have gained from our culture or background, or from the media we listen to or people we admire. Unfortunately, those assumptions are often wrong. When we categorize people, our brains apply two other tools. One is affinity bias, a hardwired preference to respond positively to people who look, sound, and act like ourselves. Brain imaging scans show that when people are shown images of faces that differ from their own, it activates in milliseconds activity in the part of the unconscious brain that alerts us to possible danger. This may reflect a survival tool left over from ancient times when danger often came from those outside our immediate group. Today, however, this means the associations and biases are likely to be unconsciously activated every time when we come across a member of a group, even if we consciously reject group stereotypes. In addition to affinity bias, our unconscious brain categorizes people into groups and then connects those groups to our learned ideas or constructs about what is good or bad. Now, we've decided whether someone is like us or not, and whether they're good or not, all within milliseconds of meeting them. So, what can you do to manage your unconscious biases? You've already started by just learning about unconscious bias. Now, identify your own biases and address one at a time by building inclusive habits. Remember, if you do not intentionally, deliberately, and proactively include, you will unintentionally exclude.
Sorry, that's me. So the body you inhabit, your self-presentation, and the information that you choose to share about yourself all have an effect on student perception and comfort in the classroom. One thing you can do is take an inventory of the ways your own affiliations and identities both those that are evident and those that are less visible or even invisible, and consider how they may shape your own perceptions and connections with others and their perceptions and connections with you. For example, do students equally afford you authority? Do some make assumptions about you based on your appearance, gender, accent, skin color, hair texture that may be inaccurate or stereotypical? Do you believe that all students can succeed in your class? So we're just going to take a couple of minutes here and ask you to ask yourself, what student behaviors trigger strong emotions in you or distract your attention? How do you react to recurring frustrations like lateness, students' lack of preparation, inappropriate use of technology, indifference during a demonstration, or eating in class? So the thing is, try not to think too much. Just think about what comes up for yourself and be honest with yourself, because the only way to get at implicit bias and promote equity and inclusion is to be really honest with yourself. I gave you the example earlier about when I hear a Southern accent. And earlier when I said, how do you feel about eating in class? I gave that example because people think it's neutral, but it's actually not, and can be really unconsciously triggering. I mentored a faculty member once because the two Black women in her class raised concerns about bias on the part of their instructor. She had singled them out for eating in class when other non-Black students were not chastised. She hadn't even been aware of it. Now I lost my place. For whatever reason, their eating really bothered her, but the other students did not. So it's that kind of thing that we're encouraging you to raise from unconscious to conscious, because as we've said before, once it's conscious, you can decide whether or how to act on it. Now, okay. I'm actually just going to ask us to sit with that for a moment. Would you go back, Sophia? And anyone who's willing to share anything in the chat about what's come up in thinking about. And if this is your first time teaching or you haven't taught for a while, instead of thinking about student behaviors, you could think about a coworker or a partner or a stranger.
Rita, do you mind if I share something?
Please go ahead.
So before I started working in the faculty center, I worked in fellowships advising, and I would help students apply for Fulbright, Rhodes, all these fancy awards. And it was pretty exciting because they might get funded to go live somewhere and study something. But time and time again, students would schedule appointments with me and not show up. And I was infuriated. I just thought, how do you want me to fight for you and you're not even holding your commitments? At the same time, for those same awards, I would often meet with faculty who were writing letters of recommendation for these students or referring students to me so that I could follow up and see if they could apply for some of the awards. And faculty would also stand me up. We'd be scheduled for coffee and I'd be sitting there 10 minutes, 15 minutes, time passes. And, I would write them these really friendly emails afterwards, like, oh, I know you're slammed. So much is going on. Is there any way we could reschedule? And it was only when I started this work much later that I realized I wasn't extending my students the kind of grace I was extending faculty. I was so triggered when students were late or not behaving in the way I thought they should. But when faculty were doing the same thing, I already had the excuses written for them. And if I could go back, I would try to correct that a bit and remind myself, okay, why do I think a student should behave any differently than a faculty member when it comes to this? And these responses in the chat.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I love the responses in the chat. I want to call attention to one that kind of highlights the assumptions that we make about students that might not be at all true. And, one thing you can do when you have your discussion about community agreements, because many of these things can actually be addressed in conversation with your students and then agreed to in your community agreements. I was at Parsons Curriculum Day last week and was co-facilitating discussions around attendance, because attendance has become, since COVID, attitudes toward attendance have changed. There's, and particularly with university guidance, that if you don't feel well, don't come to class. And so attendance can actually be discussed and saying, part of what we're doing is we're a community of learners. We need to be here for each other, but to the attendance, to the question of, I feel like they're not paying attention, either if they're on their phone or their eyes are closed or they're doodling, like my friend Sheena does all the time, to actually talk about that with your students and the importance not of just being in the room, but being present and being engaged. And my friend Sheena, when she's doodling, I know she's engaged because that's how she pays attention. And I know that because when she's got something to say, she'll say it. And it's always really smart. So even to share the kinds of things that might be triggering for you, saying, I would like to propose that we all agree that no one's going to look at their phone unless you're expecting a really important text from somebody about something urgent, like a medical something or that, and you tell me beforehand so that I know you need to check. But this is why I would like to propose that. How do people feel about that? And some students are going to panic, like, I check my phone every 5 seconds. But to be able to have the conversation, and for you to be able to say as an instructor, these are things that I react to, and this is why. And can we talk about that? Lateness upsets me because I think you don't care about my class. You're human too. And it's really important at this time for students to remember that you're human too, because they tend to forget. You are in a position of power. You do control their grades. You do control how you respond to their work, but you're also a human being. And these days, with the rise of ugly speech delivered through the anonymity of social media, more than ever, I think we need to remind students that they are humans. All students in the classroom are humans, and so am I, and I will make mistakes, and I have emotions too. Sheena, do you want to add to that? Sophia, either of you?
I just want to highlight one thing you said about letting students know why you're making that decision, how it makes you feel. I think that's really important and helpful so that it doesn't feel like some sort of arbitrary rule or total mistrust. But when they can understand that you're impacted by something and that impacts your teaching and that impacts the entire learning environment, maybe they will be more willing to adhere to what you're asking for.
Okay, next slide, please, Sophia. So we've talked a lot at you, I apologize, but we've talked about a lot about thinking about learning and thinking about creating a learning environment that supports learning. I mentioned earlier a taxonomy that I really like. This is it. This is the taxonomy of significant learning. Bloom's 3 domains are kind of pyramidal and suggest a progression from lower to higher order thinking and experiencing. Dee Fink's taxonomy of significant learning is a wheel. And I really like it because it's much more holistic and it's iterative. Learning feeds learning. I wanted to end with this because you're learning. You're learning how to be a better teacher. Even if you're a terrific teacher, we can all improve. And one of the things that Sheena mentioned earlier was not just putting diversely representative authors on your syllabus, but really understanding their histories, their contributions to a field. That means that you need to learn more about the content that you're actually delivering as well. So thinking of yourself also as a lifelong learner, because you all are. You wouldn't be teachers if you weren't lifelong learners. But I'm wondering how this representation would help you think about your own learning. So it begins starting with the upper right. So I'm describing, this looks like a wheel. There are red arrows that constitute the tire. And then there are 6 spokes, and it's kind of cut up into 6 equally sized pieces of pie. Learning how to learn is becoming a better learner, inquiring about things and becoming self-directed. This is very important for students to learn, to help them to learn to become self-directed learners. The next piece of the pie is foundational knowledge, understanding and remembering, just like Bloom's was in the cognitive domain. And then the piece of the pie that's labeled application is about skills, thinking critically, creatively, and practically, and could also be said to include the psychomotor areas, the physical activities, skills. The next slice of the pie, the 4th slice, is integration. It's about making connections among ideas, people, realms of life. It incorporates both intellection and emotional elements. And this is the stuff that ChatGPT can't do. Actually, all 3 of these next 3 are the stuff that ChatGPT and all these generative AI things can't do. They can't do integration. They certainly can't do the human dimension, which is learning about yourself and others, and includes cognitive, the affective, the emotional, and the physical, the psychomotor. And then the last slice of the pie, until we return full circle, is caring. ChatGPT seems to care, but it's just putting words together, following other words based on their predictive models. Caring is developing new feelings, interests, and values. In this schema, what we see is that higher order learning is actually affective. It's emotional development. It's not just knowledge. And emotional development, awareness, valuing, understanding, empathy is what higher education should be doing. We need to teach discernment, how to evaluate, assess, compare, make judgments, but most importantly, how to be open to others. And then we're back to learning how to learn. What I really appreciate about this taxonomy is that it encourages us to remember that our students are whole beings. And teaching this taxonomy to our students encourages them to see learning as a continual and iterative process, and especially that learning how to learn and becoming better students is foundational. It shows that learning leads to caring, development of empathy, and a willingness to embrace difference. Even if we don't like what someone is saying, we can try to understand why they're saying it. And then our last is who can help. If you find yourself in a situation wondering what to do, reach out to people. Reach out to us, to colleagues, to your program director or chair. It's good to talk things through, and remember to make no assumptions. We think the student doesn't care. We think the student's not paying attention. They might not be, because something is really worrying them about some other aspect of their life. Sheena mentioned the Harvard Bias Project. That's another really good place to start with self-reflection. We'll list additional resources in the teaching handout. We'll share some other materials for you to help you on your journey as you enter or return to teaching at the new school during very challenging times. So we actually have 14 minutes before we move to the union presentation. So want to open it up to questions. Please feel free to, actually, Sophia, would you stop sharing, please? Feel free to either post a question in the chat or also unmute yourself if you want to share a comment or questions that are arising for you. This is complicated stuff and uncomfortable stuff, but it's where we are now in the US in higher ed. Mahayana?
Thank you. I just want to speak to how much I really appreciate this program that you gave us today. I have especially teaching the way we were taught, because I know my education was really fraught, and I'm really, really appreciative. And I haven't been back teaching for 10 years. And I was really wondering about these things. I've been learning a lot of what you've been talking about through my activism and other parts of life, but I really want to be up to where the students are in this work. And so I'm super grateful for the mindfulness and the timeliness and just how clear everyone who created this presentation did today. It's very vital. And the last little bit of teaching I was doing before COVID, I needed to know this and nobody was sharing it with me. So I'm really grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahayana. There's a question in the chat that I want to address. I don't see the first one, but Christine says, echoing Jesus's comment, what is the best way to encourage students when a steamroller student is in the mix? Somebody had asked about remind me what move up means in the community agreements. First of all, I like that because these kinds of community agreements actually come from the community organizing field, where you're bringing together groups of people with complementary but sometimes competing agendas, and how can we all be present and come to mutual understanding and agreement about what we're going to do. And so move up used to be step up, and then people realized, you know what, not everybody can step. So that's move up your listening, move up your speaking. And so when you have a student who tends to talk a lot, you can simply say, it is very often a male identifying student, but not always. Male identifying name. I'm going to ask you to move up your listening today. Sometimes it means a conversation. We actually have a scenario in the handout that we're going to share you, that the scenario is the instructor allows the student to talk a lot because he seems smart, he's really interesting, you'll enjoy his comments, and it makes teaching easier. And then at the end of the semester, it was primarily a female identifying class, several of the students felt that the teacher favored that student, because that is the perception if we let the student keep talking. So to establish community agreements, maybe you could even add a number of times a person can talk in class. That just occurred to me. I don't know if I like that, but it would be another thought. I don't know, Sheena, Sophia, if you have any, or any of our faculty have ideas about that.
I also think that is that is something that could be even like a one-on-one private conversation about like, hey, like, are you, it could be also like some nervousness, the student, you know how we get really uncomfortable with silence sometimes if you ask a question, that student might be trying to fill in the gap of that uncomfortable silence and trying to think they might be doing a service and maybe like not realizing that they're not necessarily giving people time to think. So letting them know that you really appreciate their commentary, but there are different processing times in the class, and like maybe, yeah, just like helping them be self-aware about that, and like that other folks in the class, everyone in the class has different needs in terms of how they process information and process questions.
And I see that Juliet posted, I'm sorry, I misread. I thought it said, I have some tips and tricks on this. And I was going to ask you to share them, but I'd love some tips and tricks on this. I hope those suggestions were a little helpful. And I see that Sheena has shared the link to the guide to teaching and learning that I mentioned at the beginning and have mentioned a couple of times. And then also the New School resources. Do please review that to see what all is there so that you know it's there, so that when you need it, you can go back to it. I'm really good at waiting. I'm really good at sitting with silence. And so now, since we've got a little bit of time, and then maybe we'll take a little bit break before we send you into the breakout rooms. But Mahayana mentioned mindful. Our students are so stressed, depressed, anxious. Encouraging mindful practices, even in class, can be really helpful, and they don't take a lot of time. My current favorite is a thing called finger squeezes, where you start with the littlest finger at the base and you just slowly start to squeeze up. And then the next finger. And then the next finger. Just slowly squeezing up. The brain, something like 40% of the receptors in the brain are linked to your hands. They are very, very powerful. And do you notice how unintentionally my voice is slowing down? This is a very, very powerful little, let's take a break. We've been talking about some difficult stuff, or we've been going for a while. Let's connect to our bodies. Dina and Sophia and Kate, is there anything in the chat that we want to address?
It looks like questions that have been coming in are being answered, and thank you all for your kind words. I echo you all. This is a fantastic presentation, and it is always inspiring to listen to.
Kate, do you think, should we send folks off directly to the breakouts, or?
So we're scheduled to both ACT UAW and AFM 802s. So that's the local 7902. And our jazz units have each will have a breakout room starting at 11:10. I wonder if anybody right now needs a quick 3-minute bio break before we open up the break room. And then we can come back and get moving on the last portion.
Right, so don't log out, but step away, stretch your legs because you've been sitting for a long time. And please be sure to come back because you want to hear from your union reps.